So hi, I'm Mark Sanders. I'm Executive Chairman of Scalespace, and it's great to welcome you to the latest episode in our Scaling from the Edge series. Today, we're exploring questions of team performance, and in particular, how diversity matters, perhaps even more in the current environment. We think this could be a real blind spot if leaders move towards what is known and familiar in these times of uncertainty. And at Scalespace, we're a community of scale-up businesses, and our goal is to help them be more successful more quickly. And bringing together leading universities and leading business builders, we're here to help unlock the potential of UK innovation. And with lockdown being eased and the focus on getting the economy moving, we're really excited that Scalespace White City, which is in conjunction with Imperial College London, is now open and ready to help businesses to scale and innovate. And part of this is helping share relevant learnings and expertise. So I'm delighted that we're exploring the topic of diversity today with the help of Dr. Shikta Das and Fiona Young. And Shikta is a genetic epidemiologist working as an honorary lecturer in epidemiology at the Medical Research Council, LHA, and is also a scientific lead at C4X Discovery. She finished her PhD from Imperial College London in 2013 and continued as a research associate in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. She's a mentor and a STEM ambassador and is a regular advocate for women in tech. So Shikta, thank you for joining us. Fiona Young is Content Director and Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Hive Learning. Fiona led the inception, development and delivery of Inclusion Works by Hive Learning, the world's first inclusion toolkit focused on turning unconscious bias into conscious action, which was created from thousands of leading sources. Fiona is also the host of the Inclusion Works podcast. So again, Fiona, thanks for making the time to join us today. So look, if I can start, I'm going to quote Jennifer Flock here from Heidrick Struggles in an article that I read. And she said, companies that have prioritized and continue to prioritize diversity and inclusion as a strategic business imperative will emerge from this crisis better than others and will be best positioned to flourish in the new realities of the post-COVID-19 world, which I thought was a pretty bold claim. So Shikta, perhaps just to help us set the scene here, could you give your perspectives on why diversity is so important for team performance?
Mark, thank you so much for inviting me. I think I would like to start by sharing the definition of diversity. And diversity means similarity as well as differences among employees in terms of age, cultural background, gender, and sexual orientation. And I think as far as we know that in last 10 years, a great deal of research has been conducted in examining the complex relationship between diversity and team outcome. And it has been proven research fact that companies with diverse workforce are more innovative and creative. I think the main reason behind this innovation and creativity is due to the enrichment from engaging people with different walks of life. People come with varied backgrounds and experiences and have their own unique way of contributing. We can also say that there are broader issues and new perspective in decision making on problem solving, and hence making more productivity in a company environment. It would be unfair if I don't bring in some statistics given my background. And if I speak in more statistical terms, we observe that companies with diverse management team have 19% higher revenue. If we look at terms of innovation, inclusive companies are 1.7 times more likely to be leaders in their sector. And if you consider better decision making, around 87% of the time, diverse teams make better business judgments and decisions in comparison to non-diverse teams. And 35% of the companies who are racially and ethnically diverse outperform industry norms.
Wow. So, I mean, certainly for everybody in our community, the idea of being more innovative, more creative, more profitable sounds pretty appealing. Fiona, it sounds like a prize worth going after, but from your experience in helping organizations to tackle challenges around diversity, what would you say are the real challenges that you'd need to address in a smaller, fast-growing business if you really want to focus on improving your diversity?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Mark, and thanks for the great question as well. I've seen a few different challenges and heard a few different challenges from startups and scale-ups specifically. I'd say the first one is not knowing where to start, right? So we've been small and we've never really taken on D&I before. Where do we begin? The second one is what to do if your current team is really not diverse. So I've heard this a lot before, actually we have an all male engineering team, or we don't have a single Black person on our team. What do we do? The third one that I hear all the time is really how to retain your great culture as you grow. I think that's constantly, every startup I talk to, that seems to be like a top 3 challenge on their agenda. And inclusion and inclusive culture certainly comes into that. So just to go through them one by one. So I think if you haven't thought about diversity and inclusion before, I'm going to give some advice that you'll read in every single report that everyone talks about. So I'm sorry for those of you who are already woke and into this stuff, but it is really, really important to have leadership buy-in and wholesale buy-in, and also for leaders to really educate themselves, to understand the issues, to understand bias, to understand their privilege. And there's tons of books and podcasts and films and other resources I'd be happy to share that we can share along with this video later to help you to learn those things. But then you also crucially need to really align your D&I strategy with your broader business strategy, because otherwise you run the risk that all these efforts are really tokenistic, or that they fade away as soon as that passionate person who's driving them leaves the business, or when budgets get cut. And we've seen that with COVID, actually. And then also, I think the next thing to do if you're really just starting from scratch is to understand your starting point. So really to take some measurements, do some surveys, and understand where you are, not just in terms of demographics, but also in terms of your culture and how included people feel. And I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the practical things you can do to be more diverse, be more inclusive. So I won't get into real specifics now. So the second thing I mentioned was what to do if you're really not diverse, right? So if your starting point is really, really monolithic. So I've had several conversations with really early stage startups specifically about this. So first off, I think it's really important to think about your context. So if you're in London, obviously London is very diverse and you're going to need to set a pretty high bar for yourself. But if you're in the Cotswolds, for instance, maybe you need to just look at what is your local community? What are the demographics you're aiming for to really align with your local community? Secondly, look at your pipeline. So where are you advertising jobs? Where are you putting out those job specs? And how are you conducting that outreach to get kind of the next generation of your organization in? So for instance, we just recently did some job postings and put them up on a job board called the Black Young Professionals Network. So that's a great place to go if you're specifically thinking, I'd love to get BAME talent in. Well, why don't we go where BAME talent is applying to jobs, right? We've used an organization called Makers Academy before for tech talent. Brilliant organization that gets people from underrepresented backgrounds. Apprenticeships are another great one. Our sister business, Arch Apprentices, does digital marketing apprenticeships, and that's a great source of folks from sort of untraditional backgrounds into your business. So then I would say kind of final point about hiring is just to be really careful with your qualifications. I think a lot of people are very tempted to put 1,000,001 things that are required in a job spec, but unfortunately that turns people off from applying. And so really question stuff like a degree education, is it really required? It doesn't really correlate to performance. So maybe question that one. So just a few practical ideas on my third point. If you're concerned about kind of retaining that great culture you have as you grow, I'd actually say, play devil's advocate to this one, is your culture that great right now? Because what I've seen with a lot of small businesses is they have this false sense of security that they have a brilliant culture because they're quite monolithic, especially really small startups. It's like, yeah, you started it with a few mates and actually you all went to the same university or whatever. And actually you need to kind of look through the lens of someone who's not in that dominant group and understand really how good your culture is to underrepresented groups. And so, then you need to just think about, when you get down to it, culture is a combination of shared values and shared behaviors. So what are those values? Maybe there's a job to be done in really refining those, distilling those, and also amplifying them, and understanding what behaviors go alongside them and really modeling those behaviors and helping nudge people towards them, which is, of course, what we do through our program. So I could talk for ages about this because given kind of the culture change piece is what we spend a lot of time thinking about at Hive, but I'll leave it there.
And no, that's great. I think I wasn't expecting you to give away all of the Hive know-how in this video, but I was really struck by this idea of integrating it with your business strategy, because I think a lot of people we talk to, they almost associate this idea of diversity as some sort of thing you need to do because it's the right thing to do, or it's a box ticking exercise. And actually, I think picking up on Sheikta's point, this idea of a more diverse mindset, a more diverse um, culture, more diverse inputs into problem solving feels like something that would be highly desirable, and isn't at all a kind of an initiative on top of the organisation that's really about ticking boxes. So I think I suspect we'll come back to this, but I'm hearing from you, maybe there are lots of reasons you can find why you would think this might be difficult, but if you really think about it properly, they all can be overcome, and it's certainly worth putting the effort in. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly in COVID times, and I know that's something that we're going to talk about as well in a little bit, is just, why now? Why is this such an imperative right now? When it seems like, of course, our businesses are failing in some cases, we're really struggling as an economy generally. Why is diversity so important right now? But I think it's more important now than ever.
And that's a great tee up for my next question, which was to Sheikta, which is exactly that point. We've got businesses where they've gone through, and we talked about this on our last episode. They've gone through a crisis. They've dealt with unprecedented challenges, and the primary imperative had been one of survival, and they've sort of come through that. And there's talk of innovating now and taking advantage of the economy as it opens up again. But with all the pressures that are on business right now, particularly scale-ups, and the challenges that they face and they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and indeed some of them perhaps conflicting, why would you advise somebody that diversity is something they really should focus on right now?
Mark, it's a very, very good question. And I think my answer is very much in line with what just Fiona mentioned. And as she said, COVID-19 pandemic has laid it all bare in terms of inequalities, which we observe. And not just COVID-19 pandemic. I think if you look at the pre-pandemic events as well, such as the gender pay gap reporting during the Me Too movement, these events have really made companies think retrospectively how they are going to address the issue of diversity. And if we even go further, in the past, we know that diversity and inclusion make companies make better understanding of their customer base. For example, if you look at the global recruitment trend from a survey, for example, done in 2018 by LinkedIn, almost 50% of employers say that they now focus more on diversity in capturing their new customer base. So there are some positives which can come out of this, which we are observing from the retrospective data. And moreover, if you look at the reviews done by companies such as McKinsey, we also know that 60% of the diversity make better decisions in comparison to non-diverse team, as I was saying earlier. And I think Fiona has mentioned some of the very important factors as well here. However, as she mentioned, this also raises an issue that we need a comprehensive HR system to capture this personal and demographic information about the employees and compare this against the organizational chart to show the differences. And this will be very important for, as she mentioned, to retain the talent, I guess there are several examples, and Fiona would be a better person, given her experience in the podcast, to give you examples. But we know that the employees feel disengaged and unaccepted, maybe due to their gender or sexuality or even religion, and they leave, So we need to address these things. I think what is very important is to develop your own company brand as well. And how do you want to portray yourself in terms of diversity and inclusion? And I think this era gives us an opportunity to address those gender pay gaps and ethnic inequalities to be addressed during these COVID pandemic times.
And if I may, one of the conversations that we've had with some of the scale-ups that we're involved with is one of, this all sounds like a really good thing to be kind of getting to, but we can get to it kind of when we're over the pandemic. And actually right now, I just want to focus on hiring the best people. So I don't really want to, hire less good people just to be diverse. I want to hire the best people, and that seems to be really important. what would you say to leaders who have maybe got that mindset?
I think it's very important point you raise. Your very best people could be a very diverse person, as coming from a diverse background as well. So we really have to keep our minds open here, and we should not really restrict ourselves to just looking at some of the race qualities and factors. I think we are moving ahead. There's no denying it. I am myself, BAME. I am working in industry now. I can see changes all around me.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say COVID has really put us on a back foot, but we, being human beings, are moving forward very, very quickly. So there are positives, and I think we have to really look forward to it. Mindset has to change, behavior has to change, and hopefully we will see more positives in future.
Okay, and Fiona, perhaps coming back to the benefits that organisations might see from making diversity and inclusion more of a focus. And as we think about scale-up businesses and we think about how they should get ready and tackle the opportunities post-COVID and perhaps the challenges that they face as a result, what benefits would you expect them to see if they were able to have more diversity in their organizations?
Yeah, I think innovation and creativity is the big one, right? And I think with where we are right now and how much things are changing and there's so much uncertainty, and as I mentioned, the kind of rumbling economy, lots of questions about what's going to happen, but certainly experts saying that this economic impact is going to reverberate for years and years to come. I think it's important to recognize diversity is absolutely essential for innovation. So it's by bringing people together with different backgrounds, different ways of thinking, different areas of expertise, and having that healthy debate and genuinely hearing input from everywhere in your organization that you'll come up with the best ideas and solutions. And I think one of the best things I've ever read about this topic is a great Harvard Business Review study that showed that diverse teams performed better, but they felt less confident in their results. And what I think is so interesting about that is that the study showed that actually it's precisely because the work felt hard that people felt less confident in it. But actually their results were, by and large, were absolutely unequivocally better than monolithic groups who walked away from this test feeling super confident in their results because they were chummy and they had a grand old time doing it, but actually they didn't do as well of a job. And so I think, there's a great concept called creative abrasion, which Harvard Business School's Linda Hill talks about a lot. And that's this idea of people coming together and having this kind of friction and, different ideas and different perspectives and being able to really debate these things, coming away with a better idea ultimately than any one person came to the table with. Another academic as well, Catherine Phillips, actually, I wrote down what she said, just absolutely brilliant line about how interacting with people who are different than you forces you to prepare better, to anticipate different viewpoints, and to expect that reaching consensus will take effort. So I think on a personal level, it actually makes us all rise to the challenge, right? And I think as well, we need to consider this isn't just about bringing in diversity. Like I hear a lot of people talk about, we just need to hire diversity. But actually what happens when people are in your business? And this is when the culture piece comes in. It's like, you need to genuinely hear other perspectives for people that are already in your business too. So that means breaking down hierarchies, asking people from every corner of the organization their view, and actually persisting to get at that view, especially when they're dissenting, right? So kind of practicing that active listening, being really open to hear different perspectives, and really encouraging conflict ultimately, which feels very counterintuitive because we've of course been taught that we all want to be nice and pleasant and get along with each other and not, create conflict, but it's actually really important for innovation. So I think it is the job of a CEO, it is the job of a leadership team, of a scale up, to set those expectations and to set an example of this culture. But then it's also up to everyone really to learn and to practice those behaviors I just mentioned. So things like active listening and asking for feedback and really building a really trusting environment. So I think the other thing that is important to mention here is that if you have that inclusive culture where everyone feels they belong, it also will help people to get through this pandemic and get through all the challenges we're facing, whether that's, illness in our family, working remotely endlessly, less than ideal home situations, all those things. It'll help us get through those better because an inclusive environment is one where you feel really connected to colleagues, right? you feel like you're seen and you're heard by your manager, by your CEO. And so on a personal level, I think that sort of culture also helps us to be more productive, to be more resilient, more engaged. So I'd say those are kind of the main things in my mind that struck me of why diversity is so important right now, specifically.
And again, I think that's fantastic advice. But I do think that, in a sense, something you said there, this isn't just about having a more demonstrably diverse workforce. It's also about encouraging diversity of thought and diversity of input. And so this isn't just a statistical box ticking exercise. This is deeper than that. And I think that talks back to your, what is your business? Because it's very, very easy. And we see this, don't we, with lots of early stage businesses where they all look the same. They're all from the same university, and they're all the same gender, and they probably all did the same degree. And clearly, there's a sort of reassurance in that for the initial team of, we kind of all know how we think and we all know how we behave. But to your point, if you're going to solve problems that are hard to solve or haven't been solved before, or you're going to get close to your customers, or you're going to be able to tackle the challenges that are coming that, frankly, we've never had to tackle before, just having everybody with the same perspective seems like it's a really dangerous thing to be doing. And so how do you, and I think we'll come back to this perhaps in a little while, but just sort of indulge me. How do you encourage somebody to sort of make the first step? Shikta, do you have a point of view on that one?
Mark, I just want to add to yours, actually, something very relevant you mentioned, and being a statistician, I think it's very important to understand that, yes, absolutely, let's not make it a tick mark exercise, There are certain unconscious bias, as Fiona mentioned, and very relevant, that these unconscious bias should not be just a sort of online training you did, or your employees did, or your managerial team did. I think these training has to be more in action than just, a tick mark. And I completely agree with you that, just data collection won't be necessary at this stage. We have to be moving beyond from data collection and completely on echo, Fiona's sentiments here, that it's going to be more action and less of these trainings. That's what we need moving forward.
And I completely agree. But I think in terms of, the mindset that allows you to move forward and do something to be positive in this direction. Fiona, do you have any top tips of how to even begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the best place to begin is to really deeply study psychological safety. This is a really interesting concept. So Amy Edmondson is the main researcher behind this. And how I became aware of it actually was I was studying up, some stuff around inclusion. It came up a few times as it's kind of the bedrock of inclusion is psychological safety. And then I read this interesting study that Google did a few years back called Project Aristotle. And they did this massive study of internal teams. They looked top to bottom, trying to understand what makes the greatest teams at Google tick. And interesting, they found that the performance of the team wasn't actually down to the performance of each individual member of that team. That didn't make them great. And it took them years to figure out what it was. And they ultimately isolated that the number one factor by far was psychological safety. And so that's this trust you have with people, more than just like a familiarity trust, like, oh, Mark, I know you, you're a good guy, I trust you. It's more like a trust where you feel like you can stick your neck out without fear of getting it cut off. You can put your hand up and say, you know what, I think you're making a mistake here, and I completely am not on board with this decision. It's the sort of safety where you can go to your boss and say, I have some feedback for you. When you're late to my one-to-one meeting every week, it really makes me feel undervalued. So it's that sort of trust where you have that not just top down or bottom up, but kind of across the organization, that people feel really empowered to sort of put their hand up and say what they really think. And so I think Amy Edmondson, like, for instance, I've read loads of stuff she's written. She recently wrote something about COVID, which was brilliant. She did a podcast about a year ago that was absolutely brilliant. She said, one of the best places to start, if you're a leader, is just to, next time someone brings bad news to you, watch how you react, and be very careful in how you respond. Because, if someone gives you bad news and you fly off the handle, or you immediately go into judgment or blame mode, or start making excuses and get defensive, you can be sure that person will never do it again. The other thing she said, which is a very practical tip, is to next time someone comes to you as a leader and says, oh, could you tell me, how would you do this? Or give me some advice. I'm working on this project. I need your help. You know, assuming you're kind of their manager, their boss, you're their superior. Her advice is to actually say, I don't know. And to really practice saying, I don't know more often, because that then opens up the question of who might know. Or, you know, who else knows? What do you think? You know, and that also, by the way, helps to increase diversity, because if that person continually comes to you and you two solve problems together, you're probably in a bit of a groupthink mode on things. And maybe it would be better to go look outside for a better view. So yeah, just a couple of practical ideas, but I think psychological safety is the answer here.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Okay, and Sheikh, we've talked about COVID and we've talked about the BLM movement. With all of that going on, have you seen or observed any changes in the way scale-ups are behaving around diversity and inclusion, either good or bad?
Absolutely, Mark. They are good. Yes, I see a lot of behavioral changes happening already. I think it's very important that we acknowledge and accept the social inequalities highlighted by the BLM movement. And we really need to be looking at the disparity data coming from all around the world, not just UK. And we need to be more conscious of the better decision making, which we can do after this pandemic. We have an opportunity in hand, and these are modifiable risk factors which we can absolutely change. I feel that companies are already making a good start by identifying and improvements towards greater diversity and inclusion. There's a lot of adjustment which has now been done in terms of screening and recruitment of candidates. For example, there are strategies in place to remove names or photos from sites or CVs to combat biases. And these are getting quite common, which is very good. There are mentorship programs which really supports diversity, and I would be a good example because I have been now a STEM ambassador for last 10 years. I have been Women in Tech ambassador as well, which is really good. We know that only 20% of women are out there. They really need the support we can provide them. In the current state of things, you can already see there's a lot of better mix of demographic, types, a variety of people in universities, which is very, very good because it's a sign of moving forward in terms of education and also in terms of the available candidates in future. I also think that we need to be, whereas very much what Fiona said is we have to think about cultural sensitivity, which is going to be quite important as well as in retaining the staff and also making companies attractive. And I think my final point would be that we need more transparency. We need, right from the hiring, promotion, management of human capital, we definitely need to invest more in providing as much transparency in the process as possible.
And maybe you could just say a little bit more about how we might remove or improve transparency around decisions that are taken around hiring or promotion or advancement, because clearly they're very hot buttons for individuals. So what sort of things might you recommend people to think about?
I think this is more of a question I would expect Fiona to be answering with her experience here, less for me actually, because I'm more from academia. But as I said, you really need a very intermixing HR organization in place. You really need to show what kind of diversity you have in your organization. These would be like the small step for displaying your staff, the mix you have in your company. But I guess this would be a question Fiona would be better off to answer than
okay,
me.
Well, let's ask Fiona then. So what we talked about transparency there, but what other things, or if you think about transparency and other things that organizations might do to be able to take steps to attract or nurture or manage more diverse teams, what practical tips or advice might you give them?
Such a great question. Actually, I wanted to address your previous question really quickly because Shikti mentioned some great examples of positive steps forward, but actually I wanted to mention one kind of worrying thing I saw in the first couple months of lockdown, which certainly in the UK, I saw a lot of my connections who are working in diversity and inclusion being furloughed, and being laid off. And, one example of this is a connection of mine who was leading diversity at Monzo, at the very beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of in June, kind of came out on Twitter and said, Monzo has actually made me redundant, and evidently diversity isn't a priority to them. And so I think we need to be very careful. I understand businesses do have to take tough decisions. And I don't know the ins and outs of that situation, but I think it certainly in these trying times, and when we know diversity is a real priority, you do have to consider what message does that send to the people left behind in that organization about what matters to you and about your culture. I think that is worrying. So I've certainly seen some kind of negative examples coming out, but yeah. And onto your question about kind of practical things. So I think you hit the nail on the head when you said transparency. I mean, that is huge, right? And actually a huge part of diversity and inclusion work is all around equity. And in the US, there's been a real movement towards calling this practice DEI. Right? So it's all about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And hopefully we'll get there in the UK as well. I think it's a brilliant addition. And also I think, it's great that I love that when you asked this question, you were thinking about more than just hiring. You said, how can we have transparency kind of in promotion decisions and in other things as well? And I think that's super important. Like, I just hear too much talk about hiring diverse talent, but what's the point in hiring diverse talent if you're not actually nurturing that talent once it comes through your doors, right? And retaining that talent. So first off, I think, for a scale up specifically, there's going to be a limited amount of things you're going to be able to do, right? Maybe you don't even have a proper HR function, let alone a kind of person dedicated to D&I. I get that, right? And certainly at Hive Learning, we're in that place too, where we're all we're doing bits and pieces off the side of our desk. It's hugely important to us, but we don't have a dedicated person who's just spending their days thinking about this. That makes it tough. So I think the key thing is to pick a few things that you can change and invest the time in changing them and make them measurable. So have some goals and, just recognize you're not going to be able to do everything at once, and that's okay. I once interviewed a lady named Aubrey Blanche, who at the time was leading diversity at Atlassian, the tech business. She's now at Culture Amp. And she said on the podcast, this great phrase. She said, there's not really one silver bullet. There's like 500,000 tiny little bullets that you have to shoot all at the same time. I think the idea is there are a lot of small things that you're not going to know what's going to move the dial. And so pick some things to do and measure them and be data driven. Like, we're tech businesses. We know how to do data, right? So figure out a way to measure these things and invest in the things that are working and let loose the things that aren't. And so then I think the other thing, just more broadly, when you think about diversity and inclusion, I wanted to share is I got really inspired when I was building Inclusion Works, this program, by a lady named Iris Bonet, who's at Harvard's Kennedy School. And she has a whole thesis around bias. She says, basically, you can't de-bias people, so don't try. So to Shikti's point about, we need less bias training, we need more action, I am 100% behind that. And Iris, basically, her thesis is the same thing. You can't de-bias people. So look instead at the practices within the organization, at the policies, look at the systems. So, from my perspective, if you look at the systems, they're mainly with people processes. They're around things like, how are you attracting talent? How are you hiring talent? How are you giving feedback and developing people? How are you promoting people and making pay decisions? All those things need to be transparent. And there's a way to design them, obviously, in a way that minimizes the chance bias seeps in. But each of us has a role to play in them too. So when we built the program, we built up all these little toolkits around this stuff. So it's like, what are the 7 tips for an inclusive interview? And it gets into really practical things that each of us have control over. It's like, ask each candidate the same question in the same order, because otherwise you run the risk of, I don't know, I meet some girl who was in a sorority in California like I was, and 20 minutes later we're gabbing on about sorority days, and, I haven't been grilling her like I'm grilling the other 6 candidates, and so you need to be very structured in the way you're doing things, right? And also I think beyond just the practices, thinking about behaviors, not just of leaders, but literally everyone in the organization. So we spend a lot of time researching and understanding how can you be inclusive every day. And so when you think about it's like the everyday things where, oftentimes your bias takes over and you end up unintentionally excluding people. So it's like how you're leading meetings, like a larger meeting, or how you're making a decision. Who are the voices you're hearing? I mean, some research has shown that something like in a 6-person group, I think two of the 6 people in a 6-person meeting take up 60 to 70% of the airtime on average, right? So there are always going to be louder people. Actually, I'm one of them, so I have to watch myself, but you need to make sure you're really hearing all voices proactively. And also thinking about how you're setting up project teams right? How you're assigning projects, who gets those plum assignments, who doesn't even get to put their hat in the ring for them, and oftentimes that really hinges on affinity bias. It's like, oh, I know this person, I like this person, or, oh, this looks like a person who I used to work with who did such a good job, and, so I want them to help me with this. And it's just not fair. It's not equitable. And even down to how you're building relationships, and particularly for managers and leaders, this is important. It's like, how are you spending your one-to-one time with people? Are you really investing in getting to know them outside of work, and really investing in understanding what makes them tick and supporting them in their development evenly, not just for people who remind you of yourself, maybe subconsciously. And how you give feedback. Feedback's a big one, right? Because that's what helps us to thrive and to grow in our careers. And it turns out it's a lot easier to give feedback, critical feedback, to people who are like you, because you feel more comfortable with them. It's much harder to give critical feedback to someone you feel like you have nothing in common with. And the physical environment's a big one. And I'm sure at ScaleSpace, I've been in conversations with people at ScaleSpace, actually making sure to design the most inclusive environment there, because it's super important to think beyond accessibility. What are the symbols in the environment, that really show who belongs and who doesn't? So it could be like the beer fridge, or the foosball tables, or the beanbag chairs, which were so, in the knots in the 2010s, were de rigueur for all the tech businesses to have, and now have sort of fallen out of fashion as we think, well, if you're in a skirt, can you really sit in a beanbag chair? I don't think so. So just being careful about that bro culture, making sure that the spaces we design really reflect the diversity that we have, or that we really aspire to have, and really thinking about those unspoken needs too. So there's a lot of work that's gone in recently into neurodiversity, and really understanding, for instance, folks with autism sometimes struggle with bright patterns and bold colors. Well, that turns out that's kind of trendy right now in office space. Like, that's not ideal. How can we make sure those folks are doing their best work, and we're helping support them to do that through our environments as well. So in short, I think there's loads of different things to think about, but in my mind, it comes down to, on the one hand, what are the practices and the policies, and how could you redesign those to minimize the chance bias seeps in? And on the other hand, what are the simple everyday behaviors to help people be more inclusive, not just for leaders, although leaders and managers are probably more important than anyone really to get this right because of their responsibility to people, but really for everyone in the organization.
Wow. So, I think certainly what the last half an hour or so has told me is that I think I'm a beginner in this topic, and I think it's really important that we move on from diversity as a sort of measurement exercise to diversity as a not just a measurement but a behavior, and that seems really important to me. And look, I'm sure people listening to this would be attracted to the idea of an organization that is more innovative, more creative, better financial performance, statistically proven, better decision making. I love the idea of diversity, meaning you can understand your customer base and your market better. I think we've heard it is a leadership role. It is an obligation on the leader to think about this. And Fiona, what you were just saying about you sort of can't de-bias people. I think one of the opportunities of a scale-up is that you haven't really invented everything. It isn't a sort of embedded practice. So maybe opportunities to think about how you put together your processes or your behaviors or the way the practices in the organization, and think about that through a lens of how you can encourage and support people with different perspectives, different points of view in a more diverse way. Laura, I love the stuff about creative abrasion, and I shall certainly be going and doing my homework on psychological safety. But I think the point being, if I feel safe and I feel like I can say what I think, then I'll be able to contribute more. And especially if I'm in a diverse team, everybody can contribute more. So I think that to me seemed really important. So look, we've usually ended these sessions by asking for maybe one takeaway that you'd like the audience to sort of to think about when they've got to the end of the video. So perhaps Shikta, you could give perhaps your top tip or your biggest idea for what people should think about.
I would say that there is no one sentence I can summarize everything with, but let me just summarize this with a quote I heard from, I read in a blog post by Martin Luther King Jr. And he says that, the ultimate tragedy is not oppression and cruelty by bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. And I think that's a very good, main quote I would leave people to think about is no action is actually bad. And you are joining the group, which is no action is basically you're not supporting what could be productive environment. So I think this is the best thing to leave your listeners to is to make some action, have some action around this topic. That's the most important point after, especially what we have seen with COVID pandemic.
Great, thank you. And Fiona?
Yeah, very similar, actually. I think my top takeaway is just take action, commit to something, be authentic, start small, and measure. And I would also say one other thing to your point, Mark, that you're a beginner. We're all beginners. I really challenge anyone who says they're an expert in this area because it's constantly changing. It's different in different contexts around the world. And it's just such a complex topic, right? So we're all on this journey together as beginners.
Great. Well, look, thank you so much to both of you, to Dr. Shikta Das and to Fiona Young. I mean, that's been a fascinating. I mean, I can't believe we've spent 45 minutes on that. It's gone so quickly. But listen, thank you so much for making the time today to be part of this panel. To everybody listening, thanks for your attention. And if you want to sign up for future episodes of Scaling from the Edge, then please go to our website, which is www.scalespace.co.uk. Thank you very much.